All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're exploring a truly fascinating explainer on Surah 24, which is also known as An-Nur, or the light. Now, traditionally, a lot of people approach this specific chapter of the Quran as this sort of rigid historical rulebook, filled with all these putative measures. But our source material completely flips that perspective on its head. So instead of just reading through a list of ancient legal codes, we're actually going to examine this text as a profound, highly interconnected architectural blueprint of human consciousness. It is an incredible journey, taking us from the outermost boundaries of society all the way into the deepest sparks of our own inner awareness.
Okay, so here's our blueprint for this explainer. 1. Outer boundaries of accountability. 2. Immunity against systemic slander. 3. The architecture of privacy. 4. Cosmic mechanics of light. 5. Escaping the layered darkness. And finally, 6. Micro-boundaries of the home.
First things first, we absolutely have to establish a massive paradigm shift. To really understand what this text is doing, our sources emphasize a methodology called tasrif, which basically means using the text's own internal, systemic definitions rather than outside assumptions. So instead of viewing concepts like zina, ifk, or nur as purely physical transgressions, historical events, or just some abstract mystery, we're shifting gears. We're looking at a narrative of deep, systemic, internal accountability.
Let's start with part 1. Outer boundaries of accountability, the social blueprint.
We're starting right at the outer walls of this blueprint. The very first verse of this chapter uses the root word frd, which literally means to specify, to cut, or to establish a very distinct boundary line. Notice how the text addresses the ultimate boundary breach, traditionally known as zina. If you look across the Quranic text, the root z in y represents an illicit mixing, a massive breach of foundational trust, or an illegitimate encroachment into a structured boundary. Think of it as the systemic corruption of lineage and emotional safety. And the response to this? Well, the text prescribes jalda. Now, traditionally that's translated as a physical lashing, but the root jld actually refers to the skin, or the outermost protective layer of an organism. So the text is treating jald as a way to starkly mark the outer skin of the social body. It's an exposure, a highly visible boundary enforcement, rather than just raw biological destruction.
Moving right along to part 2, immunity against systemic slander, guarding the unseen.
Stepping past those outer walls, we confront a totally different kind of threat, the systemic violence of weaponized speech. This is known as al-ifk. The root afk means to overturn, to flip upside down, or to just radically invert a reality. So slander here isn't just your run-of-the-mill lie. Think of it more like a coordinated modern disinformation campaign. It's a radical inversion of reality generated by an usba, which is a faction or network from right within the community itself, structurally designed to exploit social connections and completely fracture community trust.
And this brings us to a really brilliant structural solution. The text asks a profound question about how the community reacted to this slander. It asks, why did you not think well of yourselves? Notice it doesn't say think well of the victim. Actually, no. It specifically says yourselves. This is a huge takeaway. The community is being viewed as a single integrated body, meaning an attack on one person is an attack on the collective self. To accept a slanderous inversion without evidence is to literally inject poison into your own systemic body. That takes us to part 3. The architecture of privacy, doors and windows.
Let's zoom in a bit and look at the psychological protocols of human privacy. The text instructs people not to enter homes without first doing isti'nas. Now, traditional translations usually just call this asking permission. But if we look closer, the root ans is the exact same root used for intimacy, familiarity, and, get this, the word for human being itself, insan. So you aren't just being instructed to awkwardly knock on a door. You're required to establish a state of clear mutual resonance and psychological compatibility before ever stepping into another person's sphere of vulnerability. It's all about deeply respecting the interior life of others.
And to actually maintain that internal peace, the text introduces the concept of lowering the gaze. The root dod doesn't mean walking around blindfolded all day. It's really about calibrating your visual intake. The eye is a direct processing portal to your mind and heart. If we leave that visual gateway completely uncalibrated, say by just endlessly doom scrolling, our internal processing portal gets constantly bombarded by cognitive noise and chaos, and that totally disrupts our continuous conscious connection.
Which brings us to the core, part 4, cosmic mechanics of light, the inner nucleus.
We have finally reached the hearth, you guys, the absolute, literal mathematical core of this architectural blueprint, the famous verse of light.
The absolutely crucial point here is that Nur isn't simply a source of heat or some mysterious magical glow. Throughout the text, Nur acts as the ultimate organizing principle. It is the illuminating clarity, that orienting awareness that dispels confusion, allowing reality to actually become structured, coherent, and visible to us.
The text gives us the stunning anatomy of this awareness through this incredibly interconnected metaphor. First, it describes a mishkat. Think of it as a physical niche or a biological frame that structurally holds the light. Within that is the zujaja, a crystal-clear protective glass representing a transparent, pure intention that magnifies the light rather than dimming it. And right at the very center is the misbah, the active consciousness, the focal flame burning right at the core. It's essentially a perfect description of how objective truth anchors itself into a clear, receptive human heart.
And the amazing thing is, this light isn't isolated. It connects us to the fabric of creation itself. The text notes that everything in the skies and the earth, even the birds moving purposefully in flight, are in a constant state of salat and tasbih. Now, obviously, a bird doesn't exactly perform a ritual. They aren't doing ablution or anything like that. So salat in this context really means a pure, continuous state of orientation and connection toward its source. The birds just inherently know how to align with the light.
But what happens when things go wrong? Part 5. Escaping the layered darkness, the loss of light.
So you might be wondering, what actually happens when that central focal flame within a person is extinguished or maybe even deliberately covered up? The text describes two distinct illusions. The first is the sarab, or the mirage. This represents folks who deliberately conceal reality. They build these elaborate systems of external compliance. Maybe it's empty religious rituals or intense calculations of material wealth, fully believing it to be life-sustaining water. But because it entirely lacks internal alignment, the second it is confronted with ultimate truth, the whole structure just evaporates into absolute nothingness.
Then, the second description is this incredibly haunting metaphor. The text diagnoses absolute cognitive disorientation as being trapped in a kind of sensory deprivation matrix. Layered, dark voids in a deep ocean, covered by waves, upon waves, under dense clouds. It specifically notes that in this pitch-black state, if a person were to just hold out their own hand, they can barely even see it.
Our sources break down these specific layers, and it makes so much sense. They aren't an arbitrary punishment. They're the direct, logical result of being blocked by three distinct waves. The first wave represents our own internal emotional distortions. The second wave is external societal chaos, and that dense cloud layer sitting right on top, that represents blind inherited dogma that completely blocks out the sky of direct revelation. When you're cut off from the light, you aren't being punished. You literally just cannot navigate because you cannot see a thing.
Finally, let's look at Part 6, Micro-Boundaries of the Home, Manifesting the Light.
All right, let's bring these massive, cosmic ideas all the way back down to Earth, right into our own living rooms. The text brilliantly maps out three natural windows of vulnerability, or ALRAT, throughout the typical day. First, before the dawn connection. Second, during the midday heat when people tend to relax and shed their outer layers. And third, after nightfall. The text establishes strict entry protocols for children and household members during these specific, vulnerable times. This teaches us something super profound. High metaphysical consciousness absolutely must manifest as practical structural respect for privacy and emotional safety, starting right inside our own homes. Ultimately, as we wrap up this explainer, we see this beautifully unified matrix. Surah 24 is definitely not just a list of random rules. The laws governing our outer boundaries, like how we verify witness, how we assume the good of our collective self, how we establish resonance before walking into a room, these are all simply case studies for how the divine light flows through a conscious people. Literally everything, from the massive scale of the cosmos all the way down to just knocking on a bedroom door, is connected by the single orienting awareness. So, I want to leave you with the thought today. Knowing that your inner awareness truly dictates your outer reality, in your own architectural blueprint of life, are you actively carrying the light, or are you passively layering the darkness? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I'll see you next time.